Okay, folks, welcome back. Today, Okay, folks, welcome back. I've decided to go ahead and do policy before I do my property DAO because my property DAO is going to be a pretty massive undertaking. I'm probably not going to make a specific video going over each part. I'm probably just going to make a video of me doing it, and you'll get to see how I've done it, but there probably won't be much talking. So this video will be probably the last one where I'm actually explaining how come I'm doing something and why I'm doing it, as far as making the JUnit DAO tests. For the property DAO test, you're just going to get to see what I've done, and hopefully extrapolate why I've done it from there. So let's get started. My policy DAO test. So it's going to be very similar, very similar to my other ones. I'm going to have 4 methods, or 5, and the methods are going to be taken straight from my policy DAO, and then I'm just going to modify the method calls so that they are void, because JUnit tests don't return anything. So I'm not going to need that for the moment. Now that I have the 4 basic methods that I'm going to be testing in my test class, I need to go ahead and get rid of the errors caused by copying and pasting, and I also need to make sure that I call each one a void. And since these are tests, I want to go ahead and rename the methods to be a test method. Okay, so next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange these to be in the order that I like. It's not really any specific reason for doing that, aside from I like to test my registration and removing very last. Okay, I need to give each one the @test annotation, so that Java knows that they're tests. Okay, and then from here I can go ahead and start writing my tests. You'll notice that I left my in parameters on my methods, and that's just to remind me that what I'm passing in for each of my things. I will be removing them as I go. So I need to do my get all policies test, and that's going to require me to go to my database. And get data. As this is supposed to be I always do my positive tests first, And as this is supposed to be a positive test, I need to make sure that it is a positive test. And I'm going to see if I can't make this easy on myself. And can I paste them? Yes, I can paste them. Good. So this is the data for my database that I want. And with that, with that being my data, I can go ahead and quite easily create new objects based off that. So let's do let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to make a list, and they're going to be policies. And I'm just going to call it sample list is equal to a new list of policies. Except it has to be an array list. And I'm going to have to import it. So what this line of code is doing is it's giving sample data to be compared against final or against DAO database return. So whatever my DAO returns from the database, this is giving a list of sample data, so I can compare it. So I'm going to call sample list.add new policy Now, I know that a lot of people were asking why we would need all the different types of constructors. And the reason for that is so we can do different things like this. I don't want to have to create a new object and set like 6 or 7 different things all concurrently. Just to create one object. I want to be able to, what is the final row here? I want to be able to create all of these items separately, or I want to be able to create the object and set all the values at the same time rather than calling different calls. And that's why when we created the models, we create more than just the basic empty constructor. What was it? It's very important to note that if I did not have a constructor where I can pass in all my values at the same time, this test I would have probably 8 or 10 lines per sample data, and that gets very cluttered very quickly. This is why we don't necessarily want to do that. We just want to be able to pass in everything with one line of code. So as you might have been able to tell, I didn't actually have a constructor for each thing for the full thing, so I have to make one, and that's not a problem. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and add in the sample data for this other. I'm going to go ahead and do this other one, and I will be right back. Okay, welcome back. So what I'm going to do, I need to be able to I need a list of policies from my database to be able to test this. So list policy, it's going to be result list, and I forgot to create a policy DAO object. So policy DAO. Now you might be asking, why am I doing it up above the test class rather than or up above the test method rather than inside of the test method? And that's purely because I'm going to need to use it on all of my tests. And it's going to be the same exact thing, so I only want to declare it once. This saves a little bit of overhead. Okay. Now, there's a few things we want to be able to assert. The first thing is that result dot size. So if I look at my method over here, forget all policies, all policies will be null if I get an SQL exception. So I want to assert that I do not have null values. And that means I'm going to have to import the Hamcrast file for matchers. The other thing I want to do is assert that it's actually retrieved data. Now, some of these asserts are so I want to assert that I actually got data back, and then I want to also make sure that all of my sample data is inside of my result data. So I have to create a Boolean. Well, let me just list of all policies from the database. Assert that no error, or assert that a list is actually returned. Okay, and then for the next test, we need to test that all of our sample data is in our result data. So I'm going to create a Boolean called found. This lets us know if we found the primary key. And how I do my comparing of two lists is with a nested, so a for each a for each loop with another for each loop nested inside. On the first for each loop, it's going to be my sample policies, and then in the second for each loop, it'll be my result policies. Now you might wonder why I've chosen that specific order, and that's purely because my sample should be smaller in general than my result. I don't want to have to iterate through my entire result and then get to my sample objects if my sample objects are the very last thing. So I'm doing this because my sample should be smaller than my result. So I want to minimize the amount of checking I do, and I believe this actually does it. And then the next thing I do is I create a default found. Set found to default of false for each item. This is purely because we've just got to the sample object. We haven't found it yet. So we want to assert that we want to say that we haven't found it because we've just gotten to it. The next thing we're going to want to do inside the second for loop is we have to run an if statement. Policy ID, which is the primary key for my policy table, and I want to check to make sure it's the same as my policy ID in my result. And this is purely because since we don't have the same amount of items, we don't want to assert that two separate policies are the same. That's never going to happen. So if the primary keys are the same, they should be the same. And we just want to make sure that that is true. So limits asserts to only if we find the sample data. Okay, if we find the sample data, we want to say that found is true. We found it. And then the next thing we want to do is we're going to assert that our sample is the same, so has same property values as our result policy. Now I'm sure I've called that the wrong thing, so I need to import a static org.hamcrest beans and that will just say, here we are, we found the item, and we want to assert that all values on both items are identical. And this lets us do that. The very last thing we want to do is, if we don't find our sample data in our result data, that means something's gone wrong. So we want to assert that found is true. And this right here is the finished goods. So that this is the finished positive test, and now we can get into the negative test. Assert that we have found the sample. The negative test, as you might imagine, is going to be very, very similar. We're going to change it to be negative. And then we're going to just change some of the data. We're going to change that, possibly do 4 here and 6 here. Oops. The goal is to give it data that's not actually there and make sure that it's not for some reason changing what the data is, at least in this test. So, most of the rest of this is going to be the same, except we don't need this. We don't need it to be found. If we found it, we just want to make sure that it is not same property values. And this is the negative test for get all policies. If the policy IDs do not match up, and if it never finds those policy IDs, then we're good. And if we do find the policy IDs, we want to make sure that they do not have the same property values as what we have in the list. This is the negative test for it. What's the time here? That's going to be it for this part of the policy DAO. Tune in next time for when we write the positive and negative policy test for get. Tune in next time for when we do the next part.